I'm Paul Deloria for the Maui Community Investigation. I'm here today with one of my team members, Bruce Douglas, and also we have Tim Stokes with us, a special guest who will be really going in and explaining some of the forensics that we're dealing with here in this fire. And we'll be going over slides, and Tim will be commenting on all the different slides. But before we start, Tim, could you give a little bit of your background and your experience that you've had?
I've worked in three different fire capacities, or four different fire capacities in my life. It started at Catalina Island. I was a volunteer firefighter out there. I came to Kauai, got on the base, was a federal firefighter at PMRF, and then joined the county here and made it to captain, Honolulu, as I retired 2 years ago. And I also worked for Northrop Grumman, doing RMS work for the military for about 18 and a half years, top secret clearance. And some of our duties overlapped into that realm as well.
Great. How many years does that encompass, Tim, in terms of your fire experience?
Let's see, about 30 years.
Fantastic. So we look forward to you just making comments on our different slides that we have with all that experience that you have. So in terms of the incident, this was number 12446, and this is where it initially started. They say it was an electrical fire that began with the high winds, and that was the brush fire that happened at 6:35. That's what they have the incident number as. And they battled the fire till 10 o'clock in the morning when they felt like it was fairly well extinguished. But then at 3:55, then it flared up again in the same area. So this whole, so first of all, I guess the first question is having these types of electrical fires where we have telephone poles down, is that an often occurrence in terms of brush fires?
Not generally, unless it's allowed to burn for a long time with really bad access where you can't get to it to stop the fire. You know, usually the power lines don't come down. They usually come down more from either a tree, a high winds in a tree, or a car accident brings them down a lot, believe it or not. Cars hit them all the time and it'll take them down. But generally, they don't generally come down. A high wind could force that. But like I say, usually you're going to get there and try to get it put out, at least around those major infrastructures. Also, the power lines have, they can stop power through the transmission of the power through the lines. And there's also a hard fuse. It's a drop. It's a big iron bar looking thing that's on the side of the telephone poles. You'll see them when you're driving down the street. And when one of these is compromised or whatever, it's supposed to drop like a fuse and stop the power from that end. Although it may or may not be de-energized based on if it's a dead end or a loop where the power is coming back from another side. And then you've got solar considerations too. If there's solar input, that sometimes are not, they're independent of that as far as the structures go.
I see. So this initial brush fire that occurred, then they later declared it was extinguished, but then in the same area it was rekindled. And it really did take off. But now the amount of brush that was there, if you look, you can see that, I mean, it's up to 4 feet high, real dry. There's a lot of grass that is not really thick, but then we have a little bit of shrubs in there also. Is that enough to do this type of light up that we have to create this level of destruction that we saw?
The fuel acts like a fuse. If you think it like a fuse, so you can have a very small fuse that lights off a big firecracker or bomb, right? The little fuse is small and it gets the fire to go where it needs to go. So typically that's a very light brush load. Although it can generate a lot of heat, it usually burns out quick and travels fast. These type of fires tend to travel really quickly because it's light brush. It doesn't take very long to catch on fire, and it's preheated, to the point where it's ready to go. So as soon as the fire catches up, it ignites and it goes, and it can travel and run very quickly. especially like I said, uphill or if it's being wind driven. So the speed in which it moves is going to be defined on the humidity, the moisture content in the fuels, the lateral movement of heat that's pre-igniting so that the fire can travel faster as it goes. So that's really not conclusive in and of itself, because you could start a house fire with just a simple match. So it doesn't take much in the right conditions, or the wrong conditions, I should say. So that's really not something that's gonna that alarms me, that the town caught on fire because of a little brush fire. That kind of happens. We call it urban interface. And there's actually a statewide plan called Firewise. I don't know if it's still active, but I know there was a gal named Denise Laytonton used to go to all the islands. And what it basically does is it tries to mitigate the chance of a wildland fire catching structures on fire. And so they call that an urban interface fire, when a wildland fire interfaces an urban area.
Now, when you have those interfaces, do they usually recommend some type of a fire break?
Yes, well, it's always recommended, but then unlike some places, not so much as Hawaii, it becomes down to who owns the property, and it's an expense, and who's going to keep up on it. We've come up with some pretty creative ways on Kauai to try to mitigate that, and they seem to work in some areas. So that's something we could discuss, you know.
Well, just briefly, what would be some of the legislation or ordinances that were passed that would support that type of brush mitigation?
Well, I'm aware of two different issues. And so I know in California, and I'm not trying to make Hawaii like California, believe me, that'd be the last thing in my mind. But in California, what they do is they'll go by these big open rural agricultural areas. Maybe there's cattle, sheep, whatever on them. I don't know. And if they're not being grazed down to comply with their ordinance of having a cleared area 100 yards or 100 feet or whatever it is from a fence line, then they'll send crews out to go out and actually do it and send you a bill. So that's kind of the hard way of doing it. You know, that's not the friendly way of doing it. On Kauai, what in a certain area, we've had ongoing urban interface fires down in the south side. And what we've done is set up community gardens along those corridors. And so the community garden actually allows people to go and have a little plot, and they garden it and they grow vegetables, and it's usually green because they're watering it and they're weeding it and taking care of it. And it creates a nice little opportunity for the community to have a garden. And it also creates a nice little green zone between the possible fire and the structures we're trying to prevent from burning. And that's kind of a cool idea. It does take a little organization and whatnot, but it's a lot less of an impact financially on either the county or the landowner to constantly mow it. So
that's great. That's wonderful. So let's continue on in terms of the fire right now. But I think that's something that we should look at here in Maui County, and we're trying to do something along that line with brush mitigation. There were a lot of infrastructure failures that we were very concerned about. And again, how normal is this in a fire incident? There were no cell service, at least starting that day before, in the whole Lahaina area. It seemed to have been blocked out, especially in some areas where they couldn't call in or call out at all. There was no electricity starting at 3 a.m. in some areas in Lahaina on the 8th. That was well before that first fire, that first brush fire occurred. And there are some actual cell phones where people could call the mainland, but they couldn't call any local phones. So again, something very peculiar. And then another infrastructure failure was the water. And again, how common is it for hydrants to be totally dry, or to have low pressure, or and some of the hydrants actually had some water for a little period of time. And then also this other one that, again, many of us are still scratching our head about, police directing traffic for escape. So could you just go through this with us, Tim, and look at, first of all, the cell phones? And is that something that you've seen before, where it was the day before the cell phones went out?
Generally, no. I mean, that I don't run the cell phone towers and whatnot in their industry. They do go out from time to time, whether it's related or a coincidence. You know, there's too many coincidences to me in this fire to where I'm skeptical of more than I normally would be. just saying that to be honest with you, but I try to stay impartial and not biased, but that there's a lot of discrepancies and weird things that happened that day or in that time frame. First of all, with the electricity, what you just said came to mind. The very first picture you show is that first power line that fell and hit the ground and supposedly started this whole ignition process and this big fire catastrophe. And my question is, well, if the power was out, then how did that power line transmit any power to start the fire? And if it was hot, then why was the power out down the line, right? Like, who's making those decisions? Was that done by, their power company, or was that done by, I'm not sure, it just doesn't make sense to me why that one was left on to start a fire and yet the other ones were turned off. I mean, it doesn't really, there's a discrepancy there that I would look into. That's all I'm saying. And then a cell phone, I'm not really sure. We have parts on our island. We have absolutely no cell phone coverage, and our 800 radio system sometimes barely works. You have to go run to a certain point or a weird place, and that's just standard. And then the other thing that happens with cell phones is a lot of times when there's a catastrophe, we remember the missile crisis thing that we had a little while back where the missile was coming, everybody's on their cell phone. So now the cell phone system got, its capacity was exceeded basically, and you couldn't use it even if it was working. It was a mess. So those are some of the things happen during an emergency with cell phones, that communication gets taxed, and sometimes it's not dependable. But way out in front like that, that's just something I would look into as well. Hydrants. Now that's something that we deal with constantly. We have a pretty good relationship with our water department on our island, and they're really good about calling up and telling us that we have a down hydrant. That means a hydrant that's out of service, and then we'll make notation of it so everybody knows. And then we, like, as a captain, my job is to, do my job. And so I always, and this is just how I did my job, I always teach my operators and my firefighters that when we don't depend on the DMT and the MDT in your car, the mobile data transmitting, it's like a TV screen in your car that you can get all this information off of. And I'd make them actually look at hard copy as they ran out the door, and we had a map on our wall, and we'd have special notes on it and Post-its and stuff if there was something in that applied to an address that we were responding to. And we'd always look for the primary hydrant and then the secondary hydrant. In case that hydrant was out, we had plan B. And also if we hooked up to that hydrant and we had our second engine company coming in, I could direct them to that second hydrant that we'd already chosen. And that way we didn't cross our hoses where they're running over our active charged hoses when we're fighting the fire. We could vector them in down a different street around the back way, so they had access to that second hydrant. So that's all part of fire mitigation and response planning. And you have to just kind of always have that in your head, that this is what I'm trying to do. It's not always just there's the hydrant and there's the fire. You've got a team of guys coming behind you, a lot of support, and they're going to need water supply as well. And then in our districts, every year we go out and we test our hydrants. So we have a pretty good data pool of what hydrants are weak, what hydrants are strong. And a lot of people don't even understand that a normal fire hydrant that you see on the street, one with the large diameter and the small diameter hookup. Well, on our island, we have a lot of standpipes. So it's a pipe coming out of the ground with a single small diameter hookup, and those don't put out fires once they're really going. I mean, that's really hard to put out a full burning house fire, let alone a town on a standpipe. And I'm not sure what the water supply there was, if they were all hydrants or if there were some standpipes. But that's another consideration that we have to take into effect when we're rolling up on an address. Sometimes I'll stretch in farther to get a real hydrant instead of picking up a standpipe, so I got more volume of water available to me. Also the pump, the engines themselves suck water. They actually pull water. So, I mean, you can literally pull a hydrant out of the ground if you suck hard enough. If you're pulling, you can draft, they call it, and you're pulling water from that in that pumping system. So if you're getting a few pounds of water and a little trickle, you can actually increase that up to a little point. But then when that fails, that's it. And it's, you start cavitating and whatnot, and you'll start having problems with your pump, and you can mess up your engine pretty bad. So that's stuff we always play in a balancing act. Water coming in, water going out. As far as water being turned off or turned on, we're always notified if it's done by the water department. Now, if an automobile hits something, or there's a landslide or something of that nature that happens to a hydrant, sometimes we're the first to find out. So that's where we always try to have plan B in place.
So you're saying that it's one of the things that we should look at is the communication dynamics between those in control of the water and the fire department itself, and to see if that was maintained, because I hear that that's a real important element
It
that you
is.
maintained.
And then on that subject, so I would call it the hierarchy of response, or what when we're trained as firefighters, we're trained that my life is most important. So I need to take care of myself. And then my next most important factor is my crew. I make sure they're okay. So it's me, my crew, and then it's the public. So life comes first. Then after that, we have property. Property comes second. So life always trumps property. And then after that, we got the environment. We want to take care of the environment best we can, but we always take life, property, then the environment. That's the way we're trained in our hierarchy of response. So that means I'm going to put all my energy into saving a life way before I'm going to go and save the house, right? So life comes first. I want to get the people out of the house or whatever I need to do, whatever situation it is. I'm going to take care of life and then property and then the environment. And
Well,
with that said, that's the way we respond. And what's interesting to me is they had a lot of resources doing things that they could arguably say, oh, we were keeping people from going a way that could have put them in harm or whatever. But, in me, and it's easy to armchair quarterback. I wasn't there. I wasn't getting orders from above. I don't know the situation. But when I look at it, I'm looking at a lot of resources that were done directing traffic and stuff. And I felt I would be like wanting to get those resources actually on helping people, getting them out, warning them, whatever it was. And I found that a little strange, that I thought they were placing a higher value on and not putting all the resources just on immediate life safety, because there was people immediately in danger, and they were looking at something that might happen if they didn't do this over here, to where more people could get in harm's way, if that's the way they're trying to justify it. But I thought it was, to me, I didn't agree with that. I would have had anybody possible warning, grabbing people, whatever they could be done to get these people out of immediate harm's way. So I take the immediate danger first, and then I lessen it as it gets, I got more time to deal with those problems. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So you break down what's the worst thing happening right now, and is there anything I can do about that? Right. And so that's my thought process. That's how I go after it. And then we have what we call a CAN report. If you're using, whatever system you use, basically it's, you roll up, you've got your conditions, your actions, and your needs. So this is what I got, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I need. And you send that up the pipeline. So if you can get those audio tapes from the 911 logs, all that should be in there. And it's going to give you timestamps, who said what to who, locations, and the prioritization of their resources.
So Tim, we did make a request for that, especially for the numbers that we got for this fire. The big fire is number 12492. That's the incident report, and we're trying to get some specifics on that. Going just one more thing up in terms of the infrastructure was the really incredible warning system that we have that was not utilized. Again, if you had a large fire that was along the coastline and it wasn't a tsunami coming in, would those fire alarms go off in Kauai?
That's a what if question, because it depends who's running the show that particular day and their hands are on the button and who's making what decisions. But I found that to be very strange, because it's actually an emergency alert system. It's not just a tsunami warning. It's used for, it could be used for many different things. I believe that's what, we're all trained on. It generally means tsunami. So that's the first thing that people come to mind, or a test, but they go off every month. And so people hear them. And if it's not, I don't know what day they do theirs, but if it's out of that realm, then without being announced, then people are going to come probably outside of their house, and it's going to alert them to something wrong. But as a reasonable person, a human being, if you see the fire coming from up there, I doubt it's going to make me run away from the ocean and run into the fire. I mean, I found that to be a little bit, that's the excuse they're going with, or that's their plan. That's the way they came up with their reasoning. But I think just warning people, and people being fairly smart, most animals and humans have a natural fear of fire. I think they're not going to run into the fire. They're going to try to get away from it, as many tried and failed, unfortunately. But I don't think because you sound an alarm that people are going to get out of their house and run directly into a fire because they think a tsunami's coming. I find that a little bit far-fetched, but whatever,
So let's continue on this. The fire spread very rapidly. The winds were somewhere around anywhere from 60, some report around 80 miles an hour. And it really did engulf the whole area. I guess when you look at the second fire at 3:55, starting way up uh, on the upper part of uh, where the bypass is, going all the way down and then engulfing all the way to Front Street by 5:30 p.m. So that was quite a distance to move, but again, the winds were very high. So would you say that is somewhat normal, or in terms of the scope and breadth of the fire itself, does that seem like another strange anomaly?
So there's some stuff just right in this picture. You're showing me this picture. And if you didn't tell me anything about this, I would never tell you that this has 80-mile-an-hour winds right here. Now the ocean does look a little windblown and a little rough, but I've never been in 80-mile-an-hour winds. So that's a lie. I've been in 75-mile-an-hour winds. I've been in a gale force hurricane up in Alaska, and you can barely stand up. I mean, it really wants to knock you over. You got to lean into it. And I'm looking at these palm trees and they're fairly vertical and they might be getting blown around a little bit, but it doesn't look like 80-mile-an-hour winds. Plus those plumages, they would be way more laterally slanted. They'd be, instead of coming up at like a 70 or 80-degree angle, they'd be laid down a lot more and they'd be pushed sideways a lot more. Just looking at this picture, I don't think that looks like 80-an-hour winds. That looks like maybe 30-mile-an-hour winds or 40-mile-an-hour winds. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but it doesn't look like 80. 80 is like the fire actually, balls of fire will blow across the ground and roll. And I've seen that down at like 35 and 40 miles an hour. I've seen fire getting blown like tumbleweeds across the ground. The other thing about fire that's interesting, and they use this, the guys that are really good, and you should probably, the guys in prevention, they go to special training that the average firefighter doesn't necessarily go through. We go through prevention training, but they go to a higher level. And there's what they call coning. And so when a fire starts, if you're up in the sky looking straight down, and depending on the fuel load, obviously, and that would include fire breaks, and fire breaks in our situation, there'd be a lot of roads, right? And obviously the ocean, but the roads will, that's a line where fuel stops and starts, and it can jump over a road and get the fuel on the other side if the road's narrow enough, or the fire's big enough, or the fuel's, they're in the right way. So one thing is, if you take an open grass field and you start a fire in the center of it, and whichever way that wind's blowing, that fire has to constantly feed itself. So it's looking for new fuel. So as it burns, it creates a cone, it cones out. So the head of the fire is going to get wider and wider and wider as it goes. Now, the more wind you have, the more longer that coning is going to be. If you had absolutely no wind and you started a fire in the middle of a field, in theory, it should just burn out like a complete circle, right? From the ground looking down, it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. If it's wind driven, it's going to cone out like a baseball bat. And the more extreme the wind, the longer that cone's going to be. Now, that also works vertically. When you look at burning up a building on the side, if it started at the bottom of a 3-story building, as it burns up, it's going to get wider and wider and wider and cone out as it goes up, searching for fuel, oxygen, whatnot. So you've got, horizontal coning and you got vertical coning. And these are other indicators where you can look and see how the fire was spreading. And if you find open areas that it's not coning, but yet it looks more like a line, a delineated line, then that's going to show that something that's like an abnormality that you're going to look at, because generally it's going to search for fuel and feed itself to keep burning.
Great. So again, it was very rapid. So we had gusty winds on August 7th, and we had this white haze that again was something that no one really had seen before here on the island. And it was reported on Molokai also. People saw the white haze coming and coating stuff. That was the day before. And then approximately then we had 12:30 a.m. we had that fire in Kula that broke out. And then we had that 6:40 a.m. fire then with the down power line, as they said that was the cause. And then by 10 it was contained. 3:30 the fire started in the same area, and by 5:30 then people were jumping into the water. And you can see the spread in terms of the level of damage that was done you can see here, all the green is area that is untouched. You know, that seemed everything is intact here. And notice even in here, there are areas of green. In other words, that these are buildings that survived the fire. And I guess my first question is, you know, in terms of how rapidly it spread from all the way up here and totally engulfed and started to go all the way to Front Street here by 5:30. So the speed of the fire, again, and then also just questions why things like this occurred, where you have destruction all around, especially if it's wind driven, and yet we have something that survives right at the center. And you can see this here, how far the destruction was. And yet, and again, it was a rapid moving fire. And is this something that you've ever seen before, Tim?
Well, nature's weird, you know, like after the hurricane, I saw brand new houses, you know, brand new style houses with modern construction, completely leveled on the ground, and then a shack, a Hawaiian shack right next to it that stood during a hurricane. So that's kind of a weird with Mother Nature. But what's weird about your pictures or interesting is that if they're claiming there was 80-mile-an-hour winds pushing that fire sideways, and you've got a house that burned right next to it on the upwind side, it's very, very unusual that there's not some fire damage to that house. So if they have asphalt shingles, those asphalt shingles should be melted and, you know, like literally dripping. Depending on the building construction of that structure, what it was made out of, you know, obviously stucco is going to be a little bit better than your normal wood structure or something like that, cementatious, that's going to be harder to ignite. But even with superheating, when you get into cementatious stuff, the metal expands underneath it and you get a lot of cracking and spalling. And I don't have the figures in the top of my head, but they'll tell you a piece of rebar, number 4 rebar, heated up to a certain degree, will expand this much. And it usually blows out all the concrete and spalds it if it's continuously hot enough to heat up that steel, because it expands at a different ratio than the concrete or the underlying materials. Now, that picture there, it was completely like a horseshoe, and it looks like the fire was on the upwind side of it. So for that house to be white and not all brown and black and melted, or even fractured windows, because at a certain point the windows will blow out, and that is unusual, very unusual, that happened. But I don't know the construction of that house. What it, you know, it might be smart panel hardy board. I mean, it could be a cementatious siding that, and it looks like a metal roof, so that's going to stop it from igniting as readily as the other materials. So that's an individual by individual. Those, but the way the fire just followed the street line right there, and then you can see along the front where it kind of started to arc in along that wall and burn back around it before it decided to go out for whatever reason. But when you're talking about super high wind fires, anything downwind of that fire should have some serious fire and heat damage, and that fire that away, and I can't see the other side of the house to see if there's charring on the other side, but I would expect the other side of the house to be completely charred in that fire, because it's only one little small street right across from that big lot that burned on the other side. So those are unusual things. When I see that, it's unusual.
And again, you can see this in terms of the destruction around these buildings here, and then again, these were standing in.
And then when you show photos like that, it would be good because I know Maui well. I worked in Lahaina for quite a while, so I understand it pretty well. Not as good as you guys do, but when you show a picture, it'd be good to put an arrow showing the wind, you know, like the wind direction, which way the wind's coming, because then it gives you a reference point on to where the damage should or shouldn't be, or how it should have spread or not spread. And that's going to be a good indicator when you show photos. And then also on your earlier slide, it showed the fire was contained at 10 something in the morning. Make sure you get the right terminology from the reports if it was extinguished or contained. So containment does not mean extinguished, and that shouldn't generate a new incident number for the ongoing fire, because that fire is not officially been put out yet, and it's still an ongoing. It's not closed out. Contained is not extinguished, and there's a big difference between those two words.
Yeah, and they did close it out, and they felt that it was extinguished when we talked to the firemen over there in Lahaina.
Well, when they feel it, that's one thing, but literally on the radio, if I'm on a fire, I'll say, "Oh, fire's under control. fires, and then I'll say fires under control. And usually that is a sign that means that we have enough resources to manage what we're dealing with right here, where in this case, that's not going to be, because that fire, that original fire, was a smaller little brush fire, and it may have been contained. So you can't apply it to this whole town on fire. But once I call the fire extinguished, that's a big difference. You don't walk away from it, basically. For all practical purposes, you either leave someone there watching it, or you go and get, swap out guys. You guys will go back and get lunch, whatever, come back, whatever they're going to do. But it's not like, okay, we had it almost out and that was good enough and we left. I mean, I've never heard of that. I'm not intentionally.
Yeah.
We do have, and I wanted to bring this up, we talked about it a little bit earlier. Now in Hawaii, we have a high percentage of rekindles. We do have high humidity, which helps with materials that ignite. It takes a little longer maybe to ignite them, because they have a little more inherent humidity in them and moisture content. But in Hawaii, we have a lot of organics in our soil, duff and loam, and we have root structures that are shallow. And so what can happen is you can have a brush fire, and then you'll put it out and you'll literally say it's extinguished. I mean, there's no more smoke coming off the ground. You knocked out all the hot rocks. There's no steam coming off them. You think it's out, and you're right in you're thinking that. And then it can burn underground slowly and smolder. And then if you get some high winds coming off that, it increases the oxygen down in the soil. It'll actually fuel it with a little more oxygen, and just like blowing on a spark, you can get it to come back to a flame. And that happens naturally in Hawaii quite a bit. So rekindling is something that we deal with all the time, not as much on, structures, but in wildland fighting. So it's real important to get down good penetration. We use additives in our water so that we reduce the surface tension, and we get better penetration into the fuels so they don't rekindle. And you can find out if they were using any additives, or wet water, or different types of agents that they'll add to the water, to foams and whatnot, to see if they used those in that fire to help mitigate rekindle.
Great. I know that we were talking to some of the firemen there, and they said that there's some fires that rekindle a month after the fire had happened. So
that can happen if there's a substantial dead tree under the ground, or something big that allows it just to keep burning under the ground for a while. That's a long time. And Hawaii, depending on which side of the island you're on, like if you're on, my island, you're on the North Shore, it's probably going to rain within that month and probably put it out with natural, extinguishment. If you get a good rain, that'll take care of that. But if you're on the dry side and you're not getting a lot of rain, that spark could stay underground and burn for some time. So,
Right.
I don't rule anything out when it comes to rekindles. They're shameful in the fire department. When you put out a fire and the other guy's got to go back out and put out your fire, it's kind of a shame thing, right? So we try real hard not to do that.
Thanks for that explanation, because again, that's an interesting phenomenon, how things can rekindle like that. One of the other interesting anomalies that we looked at was that some of these boats that burned were actually about a half a mile or at least a quarter of a mile offshore. And and you can see some of the destruction of some of the boats that were offshore, and they were pretty intense in terms of the level of destruction that occurred to these boats. Is this a common thing? Again, there were sparks flying, certainly a lot of sparks flying,
So
especially on Front Street going out offshore.
correct. And I've seen many of the local videos, people's cell phones, with them in the water and what was going on. It looked incredibly horrible. And so this is another one. Typically, no, I would say it's don't you think it's unusual that a boat that's 100 yards offshore or 50 yards offshore gets completely burned down, and yet the house with the fire right across the street from it, only 40, 50, 60 feet away or 100 feet away, stand with no damage at all. So that's something that raises a question, but also you don't know. All it takes is one ember to go fly out on that boat and land in a spot where it can take hold and start a fire. So could it happen? Yes, it could happen. But I find it irregular that a boat that far offshore caught on fire and burned, and the house right across the street didn't even have a burn mark on it. That's something that just doesn't make sense, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yep. Good. So let's continue in some of these anomalies. if you look at the level of destruction that we're facing here in Lahaina, and then you look at the number of trees that are still standing, and how the buildings are reduced to white ash, is this something that you've seen before in fires of this intensity?
First of all, very few people on Earth get to live through a fire of this intensity. I mean, you look at the fuel load that was going on here. You know, one house puts off radiant heat like crazy. A whole city block or a whole town block putting off radiant heat, collective with how many houses in that block. I mean, that's something very few, even seasoned firefighters, get a chance to experience. The most buildings I've ever lost in a fire was, I think, 5 or 7 structures we lost in a bad one on Kauai. In a neighborhood much like this, the dry side of the island. And it didn't happen exactly like this did. It was a slower chain effect, you know, and it was just down to resources, basically limited resources and extreme winds, but our winds were even close to what these winds were. And they were very effective in doing what they needed to do to take out some neighborhoods. The thing that makes me wonder about things is, you know, just the melting points of different substances and materials. Like, you know, we all talk about the aluminum and we talk about glass. You know, glass doesn't melt easy, and it takes sustained heat, not just little intervals of heat. And so when a fire burns, what it's doing is doing a chemical chain reaction, right? So you've got fuel, oxygen, and heat, and a chemical chain reaction. That's what takes place in a fire as far as, you know, science. And certain things take a longer time and are sustained heat. And so what generally would happen in a brush fire is your fuel load, especially in this light fuel, wouldn't have the sustained heat, because you're going to burn out that fuel way before it can get to that temperature, or it can be long enough to allow that radiant heat to affect those materials in such an impactful way. So you're looking at time and fuel and heat, basically these different situations here. It's really strange to me that you see trees with still green fronds on them and stuff, even though they you know, who knows what the inside's looking like. And then, you know, I've been to just single apartment fires where every tree around it, one half of the tree looked like you just hit it with a torch, literally, and you basically did. And so it's kind of interesting if we're having this super high winds with this heat being blown sideways so radically, that you would have any green, anything that's left. But like I say, you know, Mother Nature's weird, and even in a hurricane, there's little pockets that don't get vortexed on, and things kind of somehow survive. And but generally, when you look at this, it doesn't look right. You know, it just looks like there was way too much left where it was left, and way too much destroyed where it was destroyed. And then the places where things were destroyed, there's all of a sudden something sitting there that isn't destroyed. And you're like, wow, how did that survive that without even any kind of, didn't look like there's any outward damage when you look at it. And it just doesn't really follow suit in my mind. You know, it's very questionable.
Yeah. And as we look at those trees that, you know, now here's one with a tree with leaves on it. But as you go and look further down, you can see how it's hollowed out at the bottom of the tree. Now, certainly there are pukas and little crevices where something could lodge, and it could go up into, I guess, the inside of a tree. But we saw several of these types of incidences with the trees, the way they were burnt from more the inside and having the bark and leaves remain. So is that something you've seen before, Tim?
Not in this circumstance. Like, I've seen the insides of trees burn, and it's usually people down at the beach, you know, like the homelessy kind of people, or the whatever you want to call them. I'm not, you know, and they're down at the beach, and you know, they're camping on the beach or whatever they're doing, and they start a fire next to a tree. It's like their little shelter, and they leave it burn, and it burns up the inside of an ironwood tree down at the beach. And that happens all the time for us over here. But on this picture here, I see a lot of unburned fuel right next to it. Now, I don't know if this.
No, that brush was put there after, because
Okay.
we came there. This was taken several days after the fire itself, and they had started clearing a little bit.
Yeah, but it even looks like there's no, I can't really see it really great in the picture, but it looks like there's a lot of unburned fuel besides that brush.
That's right.
On the ground around it, right? So
that's right, all along here.
It almost, in this instance, because of the coning thing we were talking about, it almost looks like the tree is what started the ground on fire, like it's burning out from the tree, and like it didn't burn from the ground to the tree. like I'm seeing like right on the right-hand side where that horizontal fresh brush that you said was put in there, but behind it, there's smaller brush. It looks like unburnt fuel right there. And then on the opposite side as
Yeah,
well.
right here.
Yes,
And
or
over
even
here.
off to the right, yeah, up there, and then across on the left side in that same line. So you're like, well, that tree that's a big fuel load, right? That's a lot of fuel and it's dense. And it's weird that something like that, but then the ground doesn't even have any burn on it right there. You know, it's like, did the tree catch the grass on fire? Did the grass catch the tree on fire? I'm not sure, but throwing that unburnt bush in there kind of throws you off. It kind of,
Yeah.
it'd be better if that wasn't in there so you could actually see the whole footprint around it to see how it fused to that tree. And then you got telephone poles right in the background and they don't look like they got a burn mark on them.
No,
So
they didn't. They were perfectly fine. And this is one of the pictures that Bruce took in terms of the burn marks here. Bruce, you want to explain a little bit?
Yeah, well, this is where you see the inside of the tree burnt, and we don't know if this was hollow to begin with or the fire hollowed it out in this particular view, but we see the inside of the tree burnt, but the bark on the outside still intact.
yeah, that's the question you just said is exactly the question in my mind. So what was done prior to the fire and what was the state of that tree prior to the fire? And these are all things that are going to be hard to really figure out. But from what I understand, looking at some of these other people that are claiming like dues and this stuff, that if they are using that the moisture content should be drastically reduced if the center of that tree was on fire. If you cut up farther into the tree, a little higher where the fire didn't actually touch, and take a moisture gauge, a little moisture meter, which we use in the wood shop all the time, and you just take the moisture, find a big log on the ground that was compromised by fire on the bottom or whatever, maybe take a chainsaw, cut it down in the middle where and where it's not been dehydrated by the elements, and then take your moisture gauge and see if you have less moisture in the center of the tree than the outside of the tree, because in a normal fire, the outside of the tree would be what caught on fire first, and she would have a lower moisture content on the outside of the material than on the inside. But if you have the opposite, it's going to show that that's not normal, right? Does that make sense? Right.
Yeah.
So the outside of the tree would be the one that was exposed to sun, heat from the fire and whatnot. And so it should be losing its moisture more than the inside. In this case, it looks like the opposite was true.
So good. So there's your log that Bruce said he would send some more pictures of.
Yeah, so it looks like the very outside of that's hardly even affected at all. The skin of the log looks like it hasn't even been touched by flame, yet the inside is charcoal. That's just not how it usually works.
So I'm going to go back to a photo here, and you take a look at it and you can see the big trunk here is burned on the inside, but not the outside. But what really gets telling is here's a small piece right here.
That's the one I looked at.
And that one, you can see it's charred on the inside, but the outside of the bark is still totally intact.
Not even burnt, not even
burned.
Yeah.
But you see the inside.
And that's what I was talking about. That was exact. That's a great photo for that, proving that point. Because, and the other thing you want to do when you take these photos is try to get the photo all the way around that object, like the back side of it or whatever. So you can't see if it was that way all the way around the piece of wood, or one side might have been the fuse side where the fire impacted.
Well, unfortunately, at this point, the National Guard were chasing us away. So.
Yeah, no. I'm just saying, to be 100% like, but yeah, when you look at that photo, I look at it and go, that is so, it's like someone barbecued it from the inside out.
Yeah.
And that's not, I've never seen that ever naturally occurring.
We can go back to trees a little later on, but let's look at some of the vehicles and some of the strangeness of how the actual different cars were affected. Notice how this is totally fried right here along the very back. And then there's almost a straight line where this is pretty much disintegrated.
Yeah.
And then kind of stops here. But you can see the line and how this telephone pole is perfectly fine with the transformers still there. And we have the trees still doing fine. The telephone lines are still up, but to have this kind of be incinerated the way it is, just the front part of the car, could you comment on that, Tim?
So generally your hydrocarbons, cars are pretty nasty, right? First of all, they're full of plastics and stuff. That's really bad smoke. Most people, are overcome by the toxic smoke and fumes before the fire in these situations. Hope, thank God. And so in the front, you've got the engine and you've got your oils, you know, and you got a fuel tank in the car. And most of the times they don't blow up like the movies. They'll make a little pop at best. And as far as fuel goes, if the fuel is compromised, it'll run out on the ground and cause some different trailings and stuff. If it's not compromised, then, you know, and the vapors, like I said, vapors are what burn. So an empty fuel tank will be more inept to explode, where a full fuel tank would be more inept to burn. As far as the way these cars burn, it does look funny that how one part of the car is completely just almost just like looks like powder almost, you know, and where the materials have been completely destroyed and converted into something else than the steel or whatever they were made out of, the alloy. And then you see another part of a car that's over there that's partially got caught on fire, which is a weird part for a car to catch on fire, is in the back like that, because there's really nothing back there. Usually the fuel tank's up a little more forward, but like I say, I'm not an expert on that car and I don't even know what kind of car it is. You know, they build them all a little different, but it's weird that the back of that car is what chose to catch on fire instead of the other parts of the car. And that might have been just charring from the radiant heat from that primary car that was ignited. So, you know, it's really hard to tell. Cars are difficult because you want to really look at with vehicles is the type of materials in the vehicle and the different temperatures that they melt. And that's going to tell you a lot more than a bunch of pictures of burnt cars. But then it is weird. You'll see a car that's just perfectly fine sitting right there. And then we all talked about the blue color issue as well, which is seemed to be a reoccurring thing. Whether there's science behind it or not, I'm not sure, but it is another question. But it's weird what materials burn. A lot of cars, they're plastic lenses on the they're not glass, right? They're usually plastic lenses on all your lights, and those would be generally the stuff that, as radiant heat, if one car's catching the other car on fire, usually that's what the plastics and the rubbers are what are going to catch on first before the metal ever catches on fire. Yeah. And then some metals will actually create their own oxygen and you can't put them out. So magnesium is one of those that's oftenly found in aftermarket products in cars. Also, some of the older cars had aluminum and magnesium components in them, which become extremely hard to put out, basically like phosphorus or something. It is very difficult to put out. You can drown them in water and they don't go out. So you've got a lot of different things going on there. So you've really got to take each car, look at the model, the make, look at what elements are in that car, where the fuel tanks are located. Rubber, we all know when you see a car on fire and you see the big black smoke, that's generally the tires. The tires put off the big, heavy black smoke. And the tires are another thing that like to burn. Once they're ignited, they're hard to put out. And so you'll see a common thread of tires all being missing, and yet you have that car right there where the metal looks quite burned and the tire's not burned. Right. So that's kind of weird. That's something that catches my eye.
Yep. Let's look at another one here. Now, this was taken, I took this picture that is right next to where the light brush burnt, but there was no other fuel other than the car just parked in this area. You can see it was on asphalt. The asphalt here in the back is perfectly fine. It's not burnt around. And what's strange is you can see this Quonset hut here that is a storage area that was untouched. This house, there was a few tiles on the roof that were that needed repair, but other than that, it was perfectly fine. And even you can see this dead, combustible material here that's still intact. And again, it looks like it was just cut in half. And this whole back part, you can even see the cans here in the storage area that were in perfectly fine shape.
And that's the two things, what you just noticed, the first things that popped in my head was that the three things that you keyed on, and that's the first three things that popped in my head. Here you have basically a white building or a very light colored building that would be very susceptible to smoke damage and charring and stuff. And you can see they've got asphalt shingles right there on that little eyebrow roof that pops out over, looks like maybe a laundry room or whatever that is. And those don't look to be damaged really that bad. And you've got ultra thin, dry, what we would call kindling up on that fence, that's the stuff you would start fires with. And the reason you start fires with that little stuff instead of big logs is because it readily ignites more than a tree. You can't take a 10-inch tree and hit it with a big lighter and catch it on fire. It's pretty hard to do. Try it sometime. And yet that little light stuff is what you put together in a pile, make a kindling, and that starts the fire. Then that gets the bigger woods on fire. And then that's how you create a fire. So it's really strange. And especially if heat rises, that's right in the heat path of that fire. And yet there it is, not burned. And that is extremely, goes against a lot of physics right there. And then in the cabinet, the little cabinet in the side where he's got his, I can't really tell what they are, but if they're aerosol cans, they don't take much to rupture and pop, and they'll usually show signs of weakening and like bulging on them when they get hot. And if, that fire looked like it was a very hot fire in the cab area, in the front area of that car, and yet those cans don't look that compromised. But then there's the tire right next to it that's not burned either. It looks like it was burned enough to make it go flat, but it didn't ignite completely. So there's these really weird lines on where the fire just was completely devastating and where it really was ineffective. And those lines are really kind of a question. They just don't look natural. But that's just me, and I'm not God's gift of firefighting. I've done it for a while, and I pay attention. I've been to a lot of different schools and classes on almost everything in the fire department. I've got a lot of certificates in everything from bomb making or energized materials labs, they call it, nuclear stuff. I've handled VX and different nerve agents, all kinds of crazy stuff. And this just is, these are the questions that you're seeing. These are the questions I'm seeing too. And those are just questions, at this point.
Yeah.
But that's where I really think that you need to focus and look at, because it doesn't add up. It just doesn't look right.
Yeah, Tim, I can understand aluminum melting. It melts at 1200 degrees, which
Yes,
is within the
1200.
range. But
Yeah.
steel, here we have the steel doors, steel melting off that previous vehicle we've seen.
There's
How would
different
that be? Because steel's 2500 degrees as far as I
right.
understand.
And then you got to look at that's what I'm saying. You got to look at the make of the cars and find out if it's true steel, what type of steel it is. Is it an alloy or what's going on there? Because the different alloys may have components in them that are more readily to burn than hard iron, cold iron. But also a lot of the cars now, they have a boron rod that runs horizontally through the dashboard. And we have these thing called the jaws of life. Everybody's heard about them. And you get into a car accident and you start using this tool and you cut open things. So the nadir pins on the doors are pretty hard steel that locks your door. And those are things that you can actually break your cutters if you don't do it right, or you're using the wrong cutter in the wrong way. And then that boron rod that runs through the dashboard from side to side, it's a very heavy structural component, and it's not readily cut with those tools. We're told to avoid it because we could damage our cutters. And so those are different metals. And so what you really need to do is look at the different metals in each vehicle and then do what you just said. Like, we know aluminum burns at 1200 degrees. Start finding the degrees that these other fuels or in metals are burned at. Even the glass, which is very suspect to me because glass is pretty high temp and prolonged.
Yep, 2500, and you can see 2500 degrees, and you can see how it's curved and just melted here, along here.
Yes. So even if you had 2000, 2500 degrees to melt, start melting the glass for it to get that liquefied and look like grilled cheese sandwich, that's prolonged, right? That's probably not instantaneous. Glass has a long heating and cooling period without it breaking. So when you play with glass, you have to heat it up very slowly and you have to cool it very slowly, or it'll break on its own accord, right? So to see it that intact and smooth like that without being all fractured, just from the picture, I'm not there really looking at it up close, but that's another thing that looks very strange to me. So these are all things that looking at the individual components in the car and finding out what temperatures they burn. Then also, if the car was that hot, then how did that little grass on the fence not get scorched at all?
Not only that, but look at this photograph. Look at how these shrubs here all have their leaves on them.
Yeah.
In this house is totally fine and intact. It was this is a picture I took, and it was right in the middle of a driveway, and the driveway was perfectly fine. The asphalt wasn't burnt or anything like that. So again, it just leaves some very strange questions in terms of what you've seen before. Have you ever seen a car torched like this in a large fire, and then have the building right next to it be perfectly fine?
So once again, here's where the wind direction comes into play. If the wind was coming from the angle of the camera taking the picture, that house should have damage or at least char marks on it. That wall should be black. Those bushes should be pretty crispy and burnt, if not ignited. If the fire was coming from the house and rolling back this way, it might create a katabatic lift with a little bit of air roll coming over that roof and suck some heat back that way. But even with the temperature that's hot enough to melt glass and steel in that car, to not have enough radiant heat to do any damage to that house, that's really peculiar.
Okay, good. So let's continue on here. Now, certainly there was such an incredible amount of destruction, and you can see just the before and after photograph on how everything is really reduced to a white ash. There's, except for the trees, you know, and again, as you look at the amount of destruction and how everything is just totally leveled, there's no real timbers left or anything along that line. Have you seen this type of white ash destruction? And again, with all these different trees and things remaining, again, the wind was blowing this way. So these palm trees, you'd think they'd be able to ignite also with this intensity of heat. But again, we're not the fire experts. So
yeah,
if
and,
you could
I'm not going
comment.
to tell you, I'm an expert. I don't know what an expert is, what that qualification is, you know, to be in a court of law and all that stuff. But, you know, we all go to our training. We're all certified in all these different things. We've been to many fires in our careers. And the things that I look at in this, that's kind of interesting. So white ash. So, okay, so when something burns, it's just not just like a, you know, it caught on fire and it burned, right? So just for an example that you would understand, you go to the grocery store and you buy lump charcoal, right? Lump charcoal, right? So it's been burned, it burned, right? But it's still it hasn't completely been changed chemically, right? Didn't go through complete combustion. It's incomplete combustion. So it burned to a point, but there's still a lot of fuel in that fuel source, right? So you buy it, you put it in your barbecue and you cook your steak. Well, white ash is complete combustion. So that means you can't go back and grab white ash and relight it on fire like you can charcoal. You're not going to cook your steak on white ash. There's nothing left to burn to give off any kind of heat, BTUs. So when you see white ash, you're looking at complete combustion. So those are very extremely high temperatures to completely, you know, use up all the fuel in a fuel source. And yet, like you can see off to the middle of your screen where that green belt along the ocean kind of runs right by those houses. I mean, that doesn't look more than a few feet away. And that house presumably had to be at least 15 to 20 feet tall if it's single story. I didn't see the before picture to remember which one's which. But so if you have a 2-story house there and it's in complete combustion mode where it's free burning and you're getting me off that kind of heat and you have a palm tree right there at the same height of that structure, you know, look at the trees, how they're just almost overhanging the houses. And for them not to burn, it just doesn't, that's completely crazy. I mean, that's not something I've ever seen, if that's what you're asking. I don't know the science behind it, but that is highly irregular. You know, a lot of those, if you look at that before and after picture, it tells you a lot. There's palm trees right there that are actually overhanging the roof of the structure. Now you got to go back and see if that palm tree is still standing on your after picture, if that thing's still there, if it's gone. I'm sure a lot of those burned up palm trees are those ones that were hanging over the roof. But there are some that are still standing, and those are the ones you want to try to match the pictures from where you get the still standing ones that are unaffected and the before picture to see where they were in relation to that fuel load, because that's highly irregular, you know.
Yep. So as we continue on with these anomalies, another one was that there was plastic that survived. We have reports of people who went back to their property and they actually had plastic pots around their property. Everything else was destroyed to white ash, and yet those plastic pots have remained. Here's a plastic piggy bank taken from the ash.
And that's really, really, really crazily irregular. So here's the thing, and I'm not going to try to be a conspiracy theorist, but I got to say it because it's what's in my head and that's how I roll. But you put a piece of plastic in the microwave, what happens? You put a piece of metal in the microwave, what happens? I don't know, but that piece of plastic, if it was anywhere in that area that steel burned and everything else burned and it's completely intact and it's just, it really is plastic. It's not ceramic. That's crazy. And there's no way that should ever happen, because the plastic should be the first thing to melt. Even if it didn't burn, it should have melted into a puddle. And so that's another thing that's just beyond explanation. And I'd like to see him try to, or whoever they are, but I'd like to see the experts or the scientists try to tell you how that happened. Unless that thing was at the bottom of a swimming pool, there's no way that thing should have survived intact without being warped or blackened or melted. And I can't tell that it really is plastic. I'm taking your word for it. But
another thing is that certainly there were a lot of blue objects, also blue car, blue shirts, blue umbrellas that survived. And have you ever seen anything where you had anomalies of objects of certain color spectrum surviving?
Not color spectrum, and at least not if I did, I never noticed it because it wasn't something that was so reoccurring that it popped into my mind as something that was happening. But I can tell you what's interesting, and I've been to plenty of house fires, and you know, a lot of times after the fire's been extinguished, you know, the people want to get back in there and see if their money's there, their cell phone or whatever, you know, their belongings. And so a lot of times the guys will say, hey, you know, take them in, make sure they'll take a firefighter with each person to make sure they're safe. And we'll walk them in where it's safe, and we'll stand right with them and let them kind of dig around some of the ashes to see what they can recover, you know, family photos, some of those things that are irreplaceable. And interestingly enough, oxygen plays such a huge key in fires because you need the oxygen. Without the oxygen, you have no fire. And you'll find books that are burned on the outside completely, but then you open the pages, and because the oxygen wasn't allowed to get inside the pages, they actually were pretty intact. You could open up and read them. They're brittle, they break real easy because all the moisture has been pulled out of them. But a lot of times books, it's very common to find books surviving in a fire. So if you go to these houses and there's not any books that aren't completely incinerated, if they're all completely incinerated, you know, that's telling you that the temperatures were way above what a normal house fire is, because many house fires, I go back and you'll find books that are still readable, you know. So that's another thing that will give you an indication on how hot it actually was.
Great, good information. And I guess this raises a question that in terms of what we're concerned about, does what you've just seen here, Tim, from your perspective, justify having an independent investigation? And again, I think there's a lot of mistrust happening with our federal government and our state government at this point in time. And do you feel that what we're doing here as a citizens investigation, where local residents are gathering data, we're getting a lot of interviews, we're getting photographs from and videos from people who were actually in the fire, do you feel that we're justified in doing this when we start to look at all these strange things that have occurred?
I believe you're beyond justified. I mean, I'm so happy that you're actually doing this, and you guys seem to be doing it the right way and with the right intent. And like I say, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist and all that stuff, but I gotta say, there's so many questionable irregularities at this incident, everything about it. And unless they destroy those audio logs, which would be criminal, and that would basically just show that it is a criminal act if they did something where you didn't get those audio logs. Those audio logs, I believe, are going to really shine a lot of light on a lot of your questions about what was going on, where the information was coming from, who was given it, why resources were allocated the way they were. There's got to be at least 20 bullet points that I look up that are just questionable, if nothing else, questionable. And some of them are downright, like, I'd look at it like, man, that's libel. You know, it doesn't look, I would never go and stand in front of a judge in a court and say, yeah, I used all my firefighters to go block traffic, and, you know, none of them went down and saved any lives or whatever. You know, I look at things like that, just the hierarchy of our responsibility as far as, you know, what we're doing, and everybody's got their spin on it, I guess, so to speak. And when I look at them, you know, meaning Josh Green and the police chief and all these guys up there saying what they're saying, it just looks like they're trying to cover their ass the best way possible and spin it the best way they can. And they're just, that's it. That's our statement. And you guys just take it and accept it. And I don't find it acceptable. you know, and it's like I say, it's easy to armchair quarterback something. I wasn't there, and being there is a whole different thing. But I can offer my 2 cents and maybe my 1.5 cents, whatever it adds up to. But I do see a lot of irregularities. And I have a very strong connection with Lahaina itself because I did a lot of work in that town before I was a firefighter. And I thought I was going to move to Lahaina, and that's where I was going to live my life. But I ended up on Kauai, and it worked out well. But I have a lot of love for all the people of Lahaina, and I feel in many ways things were done by the government or the people in control that causing their impact to be greatened instead of lessened. And we're supposed to lessen the impact of these things, not make it worse. And I feel that the impact was made worse by a lot of the stuff during and after the incident, instead of making it better, which is what we're all trying to do, is make it better, right?